Welcome back to Everard Junction. Change of pace for today's video. We're going to take a look at some rolling stock. I've got a little bit of a project in mind for this loco. So here we have the new Heljan Class 45. These came into the shops about 1 or 2 weeks ago, and I'd been following the project with interest with the view of picking one of these up. I've always been quite fond of the Peak in real life, certainly when I saw one at the Great Central a couple of years ago. A very impressive beast in real life, a real massive piece of equipment, and for the time when it was made, really quite impressive as well. The Peak is one of the few diesels born out of the modernisation plan in 1955 that actually delivered the goods, that actually worked as intended and did its job. Many aspects of the modernisation plan were a right mess, and one of those messes was the massive amount of various diesel locomotives that were ordered from numerous manufacturers with varying levels of experience, which resulted in a series of diesel locomotives that had extremely questionable quality and reliability. The Peak was one of the few that was well designed and worked out of the box, along with locomotives like the Class 20 and the Class 08. They lasted a long time in service, most of them outlasting various other modernisation plan designs right to the late 1980s, with the bulk of the fleet being withdrawn in 1988 and 1 or 2 stragglers into 1989. Right until the end, they were at home on fast passenger trains and general freight work, and were generally well liked by drivers, certainly from the accounts I've read, being regarded as quite reliable and moderately powerful. So here we have the new Heljan model, and it's certainly not perfect, and I'll run through a couple of bits and pieces and then we'll move on to the project I have in mind for this loco. The main issue that's been a hot topic of discussion over the last few months, if not years, on various forums is the shape of the cab. The general consensus is that Heljan have not quite got the curve of the cab correct over the windscreens, and this results in the windows at either side of the locomotive, the sort of tapered windows down to the screen pillars where the wipers are. Those windows are not quite the right shape with regards to the real thing. This results the model looking a little bit slab-sided on the sides as the curve of the roof is transitioning in the wrong place. There should be a slight curve at the top of the cab door, and this is not present on the model. It's quite flat, and the slight error in cab curvature also causes the model to be perhaps slightly too high. So generally it's not quite right around the cab windscreen sort of area, but this is hardly surprising. This is an area that Heljan typically struggle with on various models that they make. This area of curvature is generally right on the older Bachmann model. It's generally accepted in the hobby that that's a pretty good representation, so it made the purchase decision a little bit more tricky, as although the Bachmann model is older, it's certainly more accurate in certain areas. The model does have several things going for it. I quite like the bogies. They're quite nicely modelled, quite chunky sort of appearance, just like the real thing, and they seem to have a little bit greater relief than the Bachmann example. It's also nice to have a model fitted with the high intensity headlight, which has not yet been offered in the hobby, so it's nice to have that, as well as all the ETH equipment appropriate for a 45-1. General build quality, at least on my example, is quite good, and some of the details, such as the nose end handrails, are very nicely picked out and particularly fine in their appearance. The various grills are all quite nicely picked out, and the roof detail is pretty good as well, with lots of little details and nice moulding in various places. Some elements of the roof detail you could argue are perhaps a little bit chunky in their appearance versus the real thing, but generally speaking I quite like the appearance, and I think it's a reasonably good representation. Right at the front of the bogie you can see the small wheel, the pony wheel, and that was used basically to guide the locomotive through certain curves. Later on in locomotive design it was decided this really wasn't needed. It's a bit of a carryover from the steam era, but the 45, being such an old locomotive, was fitted with them. You'll note that there's a large square hole with the axle protruding, and this is correct in its operation for the real thing. The real thing does look like that. However, due to the compromise needed in 00 scale to go around tight curves and things like that, the square hole on the model is quite a bit bigger than it would be in real life. Now, on the Bachmann example, they've just blanked it off entirely. On the Heljan model, they've included it, so it's realistic in its operation, but it's quite large in overscale. So it's up to you really to sort of take your choice. Do you not want the detail there at all, or would you rather have some representation of it, albeit slightly overdone? The cab interior is also nicely picked out, with the floor modelled in full relief and numerous separately painted and fitted parts inside. As per the norm with Heljan diesels, it runs very nicely. It's very smooth, powerful locomotive, particularly impressed with its slow speed performance with regards to slowing right down to a stop and accelerating. It does that very smoothly. So big thumbs up for me with regards to the general performance of the locomotive. It runs really well. The wheels are a bit noisy and make a bit of a clatter on curves, but having lived with the model for a while, I'm actually not too bothered by that, and in a way it kind of adds to the presence of the loco, with the real things weighing over 120 tonnes and being quite noisy in themselves. So overall, a little bit of a mixed bag of a locomotive. There's bits of it that are really nicely done and I really like, and there's bits of it that certainly aren't as well done and are perhaps a little bit of a shame or disappointment with the overall product. Overall, I'm still not sure if I would have been better off purchasing a Bachmann Class 45, but here we are. This is the choice I've made, and what I'm going to do now is put some work and some time into this model to make it look a little bit better, and in order to do that I'm going to be addressing the biggest issue for me, which is colour. You might notice that it's a bit dull in its appearance. It looks very sort of navy blue, and that was certainly apparent in the various photographs at the numerous retailers. You can see here at Hatton's, Rails of Sheffield and Kernow. It looks very dull, and it almost put me off buying it. Now, colours on models are very subjective, and it is down to a matter of personal taste and choice and what you see and what stands out to you. Certainly for me, being in the hobby for over 10 years, messing around with 00 scale diesels and having various BR blue examples over those years, this is certainly the darkest shade of BR blue that I've personally seen on my layout, and it looks a bit strange next to my other locomotives. You can see here, next to a much older Heljan 33, that there is a slight difference in colour, with the 33 appearing lighter, despite the fact that the 33 is quite heavily weathered and also has a coat of matte varnish on it. Here it is parked next to a Bachmann Class 47. This is one of their older models from about 2012, and you can see there is a stark contrast. Also, if we compare it to this Mark I coach that I've currently got in bits, you can see once again there is a significant difference in the shade of blue. British Rail Blue is a subjective colour, but generally speaking it is a dark blue that has quite a lot of a sort of teal or turquoise sort of hue to it, and certainly when the light shines on it, in some cases it can look quite greeny. You can see from this example of a real peak running around at the Great Central Railway that there is an element of brightness to the colour when it's in the sun, and you can see that aqua sort of green turquoise tinge to the paint. Even on this rather old grainy footage from about 1986, you can see the brightness to the paint even when the locomotives were in their last years of service, and once again when the sun hits it, there's that slight turquoise sheen to the colour. So with regards to how I perceive British Rail Blue in the real world and how the model looks quite a bit different to the rest of my rolling stock on the layout, I'm not going to be able to live with that for very long. So let's take it downstairs and get it repainted. Removing the body is similar to most diesels. There's 4 screws, but unlike some others there's no clips, so once you've removed the screws the body does just lift straight off. Something of note is that the fan does not have any black plastic to cover up what's behind it, and because there's nothing to cover this up, basically you will be able to see wires and tape and anything else that is showing through in the chassis. So as part of this project I'll be putting a little piece of something in there just to cover that up. I'm just going to repaint the blue. I don't really see any issues with the yellow ends, so that means all of this detail can stay intact and the transfers and stuff, which is handy as quite a lot of this looks quite delicate. You'll note how fine the handrails are. That looks really good. Quite pleased to see that on the model. Some recent releases from other manufacturers such as the Curascale Deltic certainly have a more chunky protruding affair when it comes to the nose end handrails. The wipers are also extremely delicate and a nice touch. Even when painting the same colour, it's a good idea to remove all of the transfers and tampo printing from the model, just so you get a nice even flat coat of paint. Also, the locomotive I'm going to be renumbering this to has some of these details in a different place, so it's important to remove all of these small bits and pieces before we commit to doing a repaint of the blue, and to do that I'm using some cotton buds with some isopropyl alcohol. This will leave behind a strange blotch in the paint and a bit of a sort of circular swirl mark, but once we repaint the model that will all but disappear. Obviously if you just want to renumber and you need to preserve the paint finish here, then you need to be considerably more careful and use less aggressive techniques. The main objective is to create a smooth surface so that you've got a nice coat of paint, and then we can gloss that and apply the fresh transfers and renumber this locomotive in the process. I've gone over the model with Humbrol Maskell. I found it quite difficult to remove the glazing and it looked like things were going to get damaged, so as it is a brand new model I've just played it safe and masked everything up with Humbrol Maskell with a little bit more Maskell on the yellow ends and a bit of tape for good measure. I've then gone over that with Railmatch Rail Blue. That's the enamel variety, and I've given it about 4 or 5 light coats at a low pressure, and hopefully you can see there the vibrance in the blue has now returned. Now this will work perfectly for me because I'm doing lots of weathering, so I want it to look a little bit faded and a little bit used. After all, I'm modelling the loco in its last year of service, and on the final coat of the BR Blue I added a very small amount of white into the mix just to give it that slightly faded appearance. I'd much rather have a lighter colour than a darker colour for the effects I'm going for. I'll put this to one side overnight and leave it to dry. It's going to take a long time for it to dry. Make sure it's fully dry before moving on to the next stage. You don't want to damage any of that nice paint. I'll then give the model a coat of gloss varnish and apply some transfers. Got various transfers lined up to create a Class 45, and looking forward to sort of creating my own sort of personal take on it. I've deliberately picked a 45 that is not part of the Heljan run of releases, so it should stand out a little bit from the others. It's now the following day and I've removed the masking from the yellow ends, and this is just to make sure that we've got a nice crisp edge just there and that I don't need to do any further corrections with the blue paint. With that done, I'm now going to give the model a coat of gloss varnish, and that'll just make installation of the transfers that much easier and better looking. We don't want any carrier film showing. Whilst working on the body, I've also been busy working on the chassis. The wheels still look a little bit glossy, as I've only just finished painting those, so they're still drying, but the rest of the bogies and underframe have all been weathered. I've used several pictures of real Class 45s for inspiration, and you can see the bogies have a real mix of a sort of black, oily colour, and then sort of fading out into a sort of more light brown, brake dust sort of colour, and I've added a few streaking effects and things in a few places. I've also added a crew to the locomotive, painting them in the usual sort of British Rail colours, and you can see that they fit quite nicely into the quite decent interior that this model comes with. Bit of a squeeze getting them into position, especially for the second man's position with the handbrake wheel just there, but a little bit of careful amputation here and there, and we've managed to do it. These figures will be difficult to see once the locomotive is back together, so I don't go too crazy with regards to the painting of figures in locomotives, but it is important to try and have a representation of them, as just the outline of a head and shoulders really makes a difference when you see the locomotive coming towards you. I've also carried the weathering around the front of the locomotive in my usual style, so you can see there's a bit of grease on the buffers. I've painted the shanks of the buffers silver. That makes a huge difference, and it's not something that often comes with models from the factory. And you can see all of the ETH equipment and hoses are also weathered as well. I gave the body shell a couple of light coats of gloss varnish. Something I did before doing that was unmask the yellow ends just to make sure that I'd got the masking line correct. On the factory painted model I noticed that this leaves a little bit to be desired, with some models having quite a nasty faded edge and others being a lot better. So a little bit of lack of quality from the factory there. I've tried my best to improve that on this example, and something else I've also done is during the glossing process I made sure to gloss over onto the yellow ends just to better sort of help tie the yellow end into the blue in terms of the sort of layers of the paint, so there isn't a nasty step there where it goes from the factory yellow paint to my British Rail blue. As mentioned previously, I have deliberately painted this in a slightly faded version of British Rail blue, and that was using Railmatch British Rail blue with a splash of white, and I'm talking maybe 1 or 2 drips in the cup of the airbrush. Nothing too crazy, but I didn't want to give it that factory fresh appearance. After all, these machines were pretty tired by 1988. Transfers today are from Railtech and Precision Labels. Precision Labels make the unofficial names that Tinsley applied to the Class 45s, and Railtech do their usual very good range of transfers for British Rail blue locomotives, and in this case I've gone for a custom set for 45128. Now there's various Class 45s that made it to 1988, and 45128 is one of them, being withdrawn from service in the early part of 1988. Other locomotives lasted longer, but I decided to pick this one as it was one of the last Class 45s for British Rail to officially withdraw from service, as it was briefly reinstated in 1989, albeit for a very short time whilst they tried to get it going to operate 2 booked rail tours. They were ultimately unsuccessful, and the locomotive was simply parked back in the sidings, but it was the last Class 45 for British Rail to attempt to use. So that's all of the transfers now applied to the loco. I've poured over multiple photographs of the real thing back in 1988 and 1987, and I've got as close as I possibly can to the location and types of transfer that were on 45128. As you can see, the gloss coat does a really good job of hiding the carrier film on the various transfers, and I'm quite pleased with the results for that. It doesn't tend to get too much better than that, but just take your time and you'll get some good results. The numbers and data panels and other small little details like the overhead warning flashes can be quite tricky to apply, but don't beat yourself up too much if you can't get it absolutely straight and perfect for each number, because some of them back in the day were shocking. So the next thing to do is to give the model a coat of satin varnish. The satin varnish will give us a nice sheen to the model, and it will allow bits of the paintwork to shine, which I'll then intertwine with the weathering that I plan to do, and hopefully we'll get quite close to how 45128 looked in her final years in service. If you look on the corner of the bonnet of the locomotive just there, particularly on the rounded edge, you can see how overly glossy the appearance of the model is, and that is why most models in the hobby are finished in satin varnish. Full shine doesn't tend to scale all that well. The satin varnish is now dried, and I've just placed the body shell back onto the chassis. Just makes things a little bit easier to handle, and you can get an overall feel for how the project is going. I've refitted the etched roof grille and repainted that as well to the same colour as the rest of the model, as it too was the same shade of very dark blue. Still got a few more bits and pieces to do before we commit to weathering. I need to finish painting the grab rails, and there's door handles and other bits of stainless trim around the loco, but the majority of the big paint work is now done. You can see the benefits of adding a crew to the locomotive really just brings it to life. Just the outline of a head and shoulders makes a massive difference when the train's coming towards you. I've also painted up a square of plastic art and glued it behind the radiator fan, and this just stops you seeing straight down through the locomotive to the wires and circuit board. Certainly a bit of a silly error on Heljan's part. We've been having locomotives with blocked off roof fans for 20 years now. I can't think of any locos in my collection where you can see through the roof fan and look at the wires underneath. So I'm going to carry on painting the various small details and then move on to the weathering process. As you can see, most of the underframe is all weathered, and I've given that a coat of matte varnish. But the body side is certainly looking rather pristine at the moment. I'm now part way through the weathering process, and to achieve it I'm getting things started with a panel line wash. Specifically this one, the Tamiya panel line wash, and this is the black colour. I've also got the grey, which I'll use for some stock, but as Class 45s were really starting to look very tired in 1986, 87 and 88, I've gone for the black panel line wash. Usually when I panel line wash I rub most of it off with cotton buds, but in this case I'm actually using a paintbrush with a little bit of thinner, so just very slightly wet the paintbrush and then just wiping the wash away, and then also moving it around the model. I'm trying to keep a fair bit of that on the model surface, as I say, these locos were quite tired. On the roof of the locomotive I've just finished applying the wash, and I literally run the brush with the panel line wash all over the hard edges and shut lines and detail of the model, as you can see there, and I'm just waiting for that to dry. Once it's dried, sort of flashed off so to speak, leave it for an hour or two, I'm going to go over it with a paintbrush, very slightly moistened in the enamel thinners, and wipe that wash around on the roof, and that's going to sort of blend it into the surrounding area. You can see it looks a bit clumsy and a little bit weird as it stands at the moment, but this is all part of the washing process. Once that's complete, I'm going to move on to some other effects. 45 128 had quite a lot of rust spots and chipped paint, certainly towards the end of its life, and I'm going to do my best to try and replicate a few of those. And we'll also do a very small amount of airbrushing, mostly focusing on the lower body side over the bogies, as again Class 45 seem to accumulate an awful lot of brake dust and grime in those areas when they're in service. So using the soft brush, moistened with a little bit of thinner, I've also got a little bit of paper towel just here to wipe off any excess, and we can very gently just wipe along the surface of the model, and this is going to bring out some of the blue, and it's also going to get rid of some of the clumsy bits of the wash around the detail that don't look very realistic. It does take a long time, but it looks quite effective. So that's the weathering wash now blended into the roof and the various details of the model, and you can see how by running over that with a soft brush, very lightly soaked in a bit of thinner, you can clean some of the wash from the flat panels and get that paintwork to come back through, and then in areas of detail it's going to collect and you'll get a nice convincing look as if the locomotive hasn't been cleaned for a long time. So using pictures of the real locomotive and several other Class 45s from the same year, we're now moving on to adding a little bit of rust and chipped paint detail. At the top edge of the bonnet, Class 45s tend to suffer from paint chipping, I guess stones and things like that, not exactly sure, but certainly looking at pictures from various members of the class, they've all got little rust chips here. So using a very tiny little paintbrush and a little bit of Railmatch sleeper grime, which is a nice dark brown colour, I've just added a couple of chips in there. I haven't gone too crazy, but just a few, again using pictures of the real thing for inspiration. I've continued to add a few more effects. We've got some chipping paint on the windscreen surrounds. In some cases on 45s these went right back to the aluminium or stainless that they're made out of, but on others they were just a little bit chipped with some of the blue coming off. I've also applied a little bit of grey paint to the surround, the bezel for the high intensity headlight. Several pictures of Class 45 show the paint flaking off these, probably because that's a plastic or fiberglass part. I'm also going to paint the windscreen wipers black, as 45 128 certainly seem to have black windscreen wipers towards the end of its life. Next thing to do is to apply some exhaust dirt and general grime to the roof using the airbrush. I'm going to take it easy and be quite gentle, but it's important to remember that 45s, certainly up here on the roof, in some cases it's almost just completely black or grey. We won't be going for anywhere near that finish, but what I would like to do is just create a little bit of grime on the roof that contrasts with the body side. And having said that, on the body side itself, we'll also do a little bit of sleeper grime, particularly over the bogies. So I went ahead and applied a light coat of sleeper grime to the side of the model and a slightly heavier coat of Railmatch roof dirt to the roof of the model. I then went over it with the paintbrush, clean paintbrush, lightly soaked in thinner as you saw before, and just toned that back slightly to bring some of the shine in the paint and some of the colour back to the surface. Again, using pictures of reference, but also I don't want the model to be absolutely filthy. It's been a lot of work and I'm quite pleased with its appearance, so I don't want to get it absolutely troweled in filth. I must admit I was a bit disappointed when I got the model straight out of the box and looked at it on the layout, combined with my perception of British Rail Blue, pictures, video and photographs that I've seen over the years, and how the model stood next to other locomotives from other manufacturers, and in some cases the same manufacturer. It was clear that the model could really benefit from a repaint. So a lot of work spanning several evenings and a weekend, but we got there in the end. This project wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for those excellent transfers from Precision Labels. I'm not affiliated with them at all. I just found them whilst doing a Google search. But as you can see, very effective. Lots of 45s had unofficial names hand painted on at Tinsley, and they're not typically available as transfers. So it was quite fortunate that I came across Precision Labels, and as you can see, nice product, and the carrier film is barely visible. If I'm being super critical, I can just about see one bit of the carrier film, but that's probably down to me not taking enough care during the application. The running number is also from Precision Labels, with the rest of the transfers coming from Railtech. I always get my transfers usually from Railtech or Fox Transfers. Both provide a very good service, and if it's not something you've done before, I certainly obviously don't go and buy something that's 170 quid and have a go on that. But if you've got an older model lying around and you fancy getting into the painting side of things, I do thoroughly recommend it. It can be extremely rewarding. Pretty much any transfer for any locomotive or unit you can think of is probably available. There's a vast range, so it's nice always to create something a little bit different. You go and watch Heljan now release this running number in their next batch, but for now this model is unique. Fitting a crew also provides a nice sort of bit of realism to the model, even if it's just a crude little figure. Just being able to see a head and shoulders through a window just makes that much difference. It doesn't look like you've got a ghost train. So overall, I'm pleased with the project. It's taken many hours to get to this point, but using all those reference photographs and researching 45128 was quite enjoyable, and I think I've got relatively close to how 45128 looked when it was taken out of service in 1988. So given all this work, we might as well give it a run around the layout. I'm now quite happy with it, but certainly if it was out of the box, I wouldn't be. This is now unique to the layout. It's a nice little something to have in the sidings, and I'll certainly be keeping it for many years to come. But straight out of the box and just plonked on the layout doesn't do it for me, unfortunately. So let's get it going and enjoy it running on the layout.